At 800 hours on the morning of June 16, 1943, Captain Jay Zeamer sat alone in the cockpit of a bomber that was never meant to fly again. The aircraft shuddered violently as it clawed its way through the thin air at 25,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. Outside the scratched plexiglass windows, the sky was a hard, merciless blue. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Inside the cockpit, the heater was dead. The metal skin of the aircraft was so cold it could burn bare flesh on contact. Every vibration rattled through Zeamer's bones. The engines growled unevenly, old and tired, shaking so hard they made his teeth chatter. Oil fumes mixed with the sharp metallic smell of cold aluminum. This was not the cockpit of a proud, modern war machine. This was the inside of a relic. Below him lay Bougainville, a jagged, jungle-choked island bristling with Japanese defenses. Hidden beneath the canopy were thousands of enemy troops, radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, and one of the most heavily defended airfields in the Pacific. Packed wing to wing on that runway sat dozens of Mitsubishi Zero fighters, flown by veteran pilots whose sole job was to kill American bombers. Zeamer knew that the moment his plane was spotted, those fighters would rise to meet him. And he was alone. No escort, no backup, no second chance. The aircraft he was flying carried an official designation, B-17E, tail number 412666. To the Army Air Forces, it was nothing more than a serial number on a maintenance ledger. But to the men of the 43rd Bomb Group, that number carried a reputation so dark that most pilots refused to even say it out loud. They called the plane Old 666, and they did not say it with affection. Old 666 was a pariah, a bad luck bird, a flying curse. It had a habit of coming back riddled with holes, engines smoking, control cables shot half through. Sometimes it came back late, sometimes it came back lost, sometimes it barely came back at all. Maintenance crews hated it. Pilots avoided it. It sat at the far end of the runway like a diseased animal, leaking oil into the grass, waiting to be stripped for parts. Men joked that it wasn't a bomber at all. It was a coffin with wings. In 1943, a B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be exactly what the name promised. 4 engines, thick armor, bristling with guns, designed to fly deep into enemy territory, absorb punishment, and still make it home. Old 666 was none of those things anymore. It had flown too many missions, taken too much damage. The frame was warped. The engines were worn. The controls felt sloppy and slow. It handled like a school bus with flat tires. Compared to the newer bombers arriving fresh from the factories, Old 666 was ancient. No sane pilot wanted it, which is exactly why Jay Zeamer did. Zeamer was not a normal officer. In the rigid, polished world of the Army Air Forces, he was a problem. He didn't salute properly. He slept through briefings. He wore his uniform like he'd pulled it off the floor 5 minutes earlier. Commanders found him undisciplined, stubborn, and impossible to control. But they also knew something else. He could fly. Zeamer was one of the best pilots they had, instinctive, aggressive, fearless. He didn't like flying tight formations or following someone else's lead. He wanted freedom. He wanted action. He wanted to fight. By the time he arrived in New Guinea, his reputation had followed him. No commander wanted to give him a brand new bomber. No crew wanted to fly with the screw-up captain who ignored doctrine and questioned orders. So Zeamer had no plane and no crew. That was when he walked into the boneyard, at the far edge of the airfield, where broken aircraft waited to be cannibalized. Zeamer found Old 666 sitting alone in the tall grass. He studied the battered fuselage, the oil stains, the patchwork repairs. Where everyone else saw junk, Zeamer saw opportunity. If nobody wanted the plane, it meant nobody would miss it. The maintenance officers laughed when he told them he wanted to fly it. They told him the aircraft was cursed, a lemon, a lost cause. Trying to fix it, they said, was like putting a bandage on a shattered bone. Zeamer didn't care. He wasn't looking for a parade float. He was looking for a weapon. He began recruiting a crew the same way he'd chosen his plane, by picking the men no one else wanted, misfits, outcasts, pilots and gunners who'd been passed over, reassigned, or labeled difficult. Together they formed a crew that other squadrons mockingly called the Eager Beavers, a sarcastic joke for a group that volunteered for missions nobody else would touch. But Zeamer wasn't interested in jokes. He knew the standard B-17 had a fatal weakness: the nose. Enemy pilots knew it too. A frontal attack exploited a dead zone protected by a single light: machine gun. useless against a fighter closing at 300 miles per hour. Bomber pilots were taught to hold course and let their gunners handle it. Zeamer hated that idea. He hated being helpless. So instead of following the manual, he went scavenging. From wrecked fighters and crashed bombers, he stripped heavy 50 caliber machine guns, weapons designed to tear, threw engine blocks and ripped wings off aircraft. He didn't ask permission. He didn't file paperwork. He just bolted them onto old 666 wherever there was space. Twin guns in the waist, extra guns in the radio room. More ammunition than the airframe was ever designed to carry. And then he did something no bomber pilot was supposed to do. He mounted a fixed 50 caliber machine gun directly in the nose, wired to a trigger on his own control yoke. To fire it, Zeamer would have to aim the entire aircraft. The engineers called it madness. Command called it illegal. Everyone else called it suicide. By the time Zeamer was finished, old 666 wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a flying trap. And on the morning of June 16, 1943, that trap was heading straight into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, alone. The mission orders were simple. The execution was not. Headquarters needed photographs of the Japanese airfields on Bougainville. Not estimates, not guesses. Clear, high-resolution images that showed exactly where the bunkers were, where the anti-aircraft guns were dug in, and how many fighters sat ready on the runways. Those photographs would decide the success or failure of the next invasion. To get them, a bomber had to fly straight and level directly over the target for nearly 20 minutes. No evasive maneuvers, no weaving, no running. It was the most dangerous mission a bomber crew could fly. That was why Jay Zeamer volunteered. He knew exactly what it meant. Bougainville was the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the Solomon Islands. Radar stations ringed the coast. Anti-aircraft guns covered every approach. And stationed on the island was an elite squadron of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, veterans who had spent years fighting across China and the Pacific. Their job was simple: intercept, attack head-on, kill the bomber. As old 666 droned toward the island, the crew moved through their final checks in silence. The engines were running hot. Oil pressure fluctuated dangerously. The added weight of the extra guns pulled the nose downward, making the aircraft sluggish and heavy on the controls. In the nose compartment, Second Lieutenant Joe Sarnosky checked the twin 50 caliber machine guns mounted behind the shattered plexiglass. He ran his hands along the ammunition belts, ensuring they fed cleanly. Sarnosky had helped design the setup himself. He trusted it more than he trusted the Army. Sarnosky was Zeamer's right hand, quiet, intense, unshakable. Where Zeamer was loud rebellion, Sarnosky was cold focus. They shared a belief that firepower solved problems faster than orders ever could. Zeamer glanced at the fuel gauges. 600 miles from base, no escort, no rescue, no margin for error. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a vast blue grave waiting for anything that fell out of the sky. Then the intercom crackled. Contacts, 12 o'clock high. Zeamer looked up. At first he saw only flashes of light, sunlight reflecting off metal. Then the shapes became clear, small, sleek, fast. They were peeling away from patrol altitude, rolling into diving turns. Zeros. Not one, not two, a swarm. Zeamer counted automatically as they broke formation. 5, 10, 15, 17. 17 Japanese fighters against one battered bomber. In any textbook, this was already over. A single B-17 had no business surviving contact with a full enemy squadron. The correct response was to turn away, dive for cloud cover, dump fuel, and run. Zeamer didn't turn. He reached down and flipped the switch, arming the fixed gun in the nose. His grip tightened on the control yoke. His breathing slowed. He knew exactly what the Japanese pilots were thinking. They saw a lone bomber flying straight and level, a wounded animal separated from the herd. They knew the B-17's weakness. They knew the nose was a blind spot defended by a single light machine gun. They expected fear. They expected panic. They were wrong. Zeamer shoved the throttles forward. The old engines roared in protest, shaking the airframe. He pushed the nose upward, aligning the aircraft directly with the lead fighter diving toward them. Instead of fleeing, old 666 turned to meet the attack. In the nose, Sarnosky watched the Zero grow larger in the glass. He could see the red markings on its wings. He could see the pilot's helmet. Tracer rounds streaked past the bomber as the Zero opened fire. Black puffs of flak blossomed behind them. The aircraft shook as near misses rattled the fuselage. Sarnosky didn't fire. The manuals taught gunners to shoot early, to conserve ammunition, to scare attackers away. Sarnowski ignored the manuals. He waited. The Zero filled the windshield. That was when the porcupine struck. Zeamer pressed the trigger on his control yoke. The fixed .50 caliber gun between his feet erupted, its recoil hammering through the cockpit. At the same instant, Sarnowski squeezed both butterfly triggers. 3 streams of heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged on the lead fighter. The effect was devastating. The Zero didn't spiral or trail smoke. It disintegrated. The rounds punched through the engine block and cockpit, detonating fuel and ammunition in a violent orange fireball. Debris scattered across the sky like confetti. 1 second, the fighter was attacking. The next, it was gone. The remaining Zeros hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. They had never seen a bomber fight like this. But hesitation didn't mean retreat. These were professionals. The swarm broke formation. 4 fighters dove head-on. 2 came in from the sides. Others peeled off toward the tail. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. Cannon shells ripped through the air, leaving spirals of smoke. Inside Old 666, the noise became unbearable. 19 machine guns fired in overlapping bursts. The airframe shook violently. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the compartments. Empty shell casings clattered across the floor. Zeamer fought the controls, trying to keep the aircraft steady for the cameras while simultaneously skidding and yawing to spoil enemy aim. He kicked the rudder pedals, forcing the bomber into awkward sideways slides. The Zeros pressed in closer. A 20mm cannon shell punched through the plexiglass nose and exploded inside. Shrapnel tore through the compartment. Sarnowski was thrown backward as fragments ripped into his neck and abdomen. He hit the floor hard. Blood spread rapidly across his flight suit. In the cockpit, Zeamer felt a crushing impact. A round smashed through the fuselage and shattered his left leg. Another tore through his wrist. The instrument panel exploded into glass and sparks. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the floor, mixing with blood. The bomber lurched. Warning lights flared. Old 666 was bleeding. The oxygen system failed. Control cables slackened. The aircraft began losing altitude. In the nose, the crew tried to drag Sarnowski away from the guns. He shoved them off. Through the shattered glass, he saw another Zero lining up for a kill shot. The Japanese pilot thought the nose guns were silent. He was wrong. Sarnowski dragged himself back into position, pulling his broken body upright with blood-slicked hands. He spat blood onto the floor, locked onto the approaching fighter, and held the trigger down. The twin 50s roared again. The Zero's wing root disintegrated. The aircraft snapped apart and cartwheeled into the ocean below. Sarnowski collapsed. He had nothing left, but he had bought them time. Zeamer fought the darkness closing in on his vision. He gripped the yoke with his uninjured hand. 2 fighters down. 15 still circling, and the mapping run had barely begun. Old 666 staggered through the sky like a wounded animal. Smoke trailed from one engine. Hydraulic fluid leaked in a fine mist across the fuselage. Control response had turned sluggish and unpredictable, every input delayed by damage and weight. The bomber was losing altitude inch by inch, fighting gravity as much as the enemy. And the enemy knew it. The Japanese pilots circled at a distance, studying the battered aircraft. They could see the holes punched through the wings. They could see the blood-streaked nose. They could see that the bomber was no longer climbing. Sharks don't rush a dying whale. They wait. Inside the aircraft, the interphone was dead. Communication broke down into shouted warnings and hand signals. Each man was sealed into his own bubble of noise, smoke, and fear. Zeamer was barely conscious. His left leg was shattered, useless. Blood pooled beneath the pedals. His wrist hung at an unnatural angle, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. His vision tunneled, the edges darkening as shock crept in. But the cameras were still running. Somewhere in the belly of the aircraft, the reconnaissance equipment continued clicking methodically, recording frame after frame of the enemy airfields below. Zeamer forced the bomber back into straight and level flight. If he broke course now, the mission failed. If he broke course now, Joe Sarnowski's sacrifice meant nothing. The Zeros came back in waves. One group dove from above, firing long bursts to draw the gunners' attention. Another swept in low from the sides, raking the fuselage with cannon fire. A third group positioned themselves behind the bomber, hammering the tail. The air around Old 666 turned into a storm of tracers. Metal screamed as rounds tore through the wings. A gunner in the waist compartment went down, wounded by shrapnel. Another was knocked unconscious when a shell detonated nearby. The bomber absorbed hit after hit. Any standard aircraft would have folded, but Old 666 was no longer standard. The extra guns paid their price in blood and steel. Zeros that strayed too close were met with walls of 50 caliber fire. One fighter lost its engine in a burst from the radio room. Another had its cockpit shredded during a crossing pass. The sky filled with smoke and falling debris. The Japanese pilots adjusted again. They stopped rushing. They tightened their coordination. They attacked in synchronized patterns designed to overwhelm the gunners, forcing them to choose targets and leaving openings elsewhere. Cannon shells slammed into the wings with bone-jarring force. Fuel lines ruptured. One engine sputtered dangerously close to failure. Inside the cockpit, warning lights glowed red. Zeamer's breathing came in ragged gasps. His flight suit was soaked. He could barely feel his leg anymore, a bad sign. He shifted his weight, bracing the yoke against his chest, flying one-handed through sheer will. He glanced at the altimeter. They were still over the island. Still flying straight, still exposed. The Japanese pilots realized something else. The bomber wasn't running. It wasn't diving for the sea. It was holding course. That meant the crew was committed. And that made them vulnerable. A coordinated attack formed. 5 Zeros positioned themselves for a simultaneous assault. 2 head-on, 2 from the sides, 1 from above. They would hit at once, saturating the bomber with fire and tearing it apart in seconds. The gunners saw them coming. They braced. The sky erupted. Tracer fire converged from every direction. Cannon shells detonated against the fuselage, ripping open compartments and shredding internal systems. A blast in the radio room killed the operator instantly. The tail gunner was wounded, his guns jammed by debris. Old 666 shuddered violently. The nose dipped. The bomber began to fall. Zeamer screamed, not in fear but in rage. He shoved the throttles forward again, forcing damaged engines beyond their limits. One began to overheat, its temperature needle buried in the red. The aircraft clawed its way back into level flight. Barely. A Zero crossed directly in front of the cockpit at point-blank range. Zeamer fired. The fixed gun roared, the recoil slamming through the airframe. The round stitched across the fighter's fuselage, tearing it open. The Zero burst into flames and spiraled downward. Another kill. But the cost was mounting. The bomber was coming apart. Electrical systems flickered. Ammunition belts ran dangerously low. The gunner's arms burned from recoil and exhaustion. Blood slicked the floors, mixing with oil and hydraulic fluid. And still the cameras clicked. Minutes stretched into eternity. The Japanese pilots began to falter. They had lost multiple aircraft. Their attacks were no longer clean. Some broke off early. Others fired wildly, frustrated and furious. They had expected an easy kill. Instead, they had flown into a siege. Inside Old 666, the crew was breaking. One gun fell silent, jammed beyond repair. Another ran dry. The bomber's defensive fire thinned. The Zeros sensed it. They closed in again. Zeamer's vision dimmed further. His grip weakened. He knew he was running on borrowed time. He checked the clock. The mapping run was nearly complete. Just a few more minutes. Just a little longer. A final, desperate attack formed. The Japanese would throw everything they had left. Zeamer leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cold glass of the windshield. Blood dripped into his eyes. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Come on, just a little longer." Outside, the fighters rolled into their dive. The siege was about to reach its breaking point. The final attack came all at once. The remaining Japanese fighters abandoned caution and discipline. They no longer circled or probed. They came in hard and fast, determined to tear the bomber apart before it could escape. From above, from below, from dead ahead, the sky around Old 666 became a furnace. Cannon shells slammed into the wings, punching fist-sized holes through aluminum and armor. Tracers ripped through the fuselage, snapping cables, igniting small fires that the crew beat out with bare hands and rags soaked in oil. The bomber shook so violently it felt as if it might rip itself apart. In the cockpit, Jay Zeamer was fading. Every breath burned. His shattered leg was numb, a dead weight pinned beneath the pedals. His wrist throbbed in time with his heartbeat. The world narrowed to sound and motion. Engine noise, warning alarms, flashes of light. But he refused to let go. He locked the yoke against his chest, flying with his shoulders and torso, using whatever strength remained. When the bomber dipped, he corrected. When it rolled, he fought it back. He would not lose control. The gunners fired until their barrels glowed. Ammunition belts emptied. One by one, guns fell silent, jammed, destroyed, or simply empty. The defensive fire thinned. The Zeros noticed immediately. Two fighters lined up for a head-on pass. Confident that the nose guns were finally dead, they accelerated, closing the distance at terrifying speed. In the shattered nose compartment, Joe Sarnosky lay motionless. Blood pooled beneath him. Everyone assumed he was gone. Then he moved. With an effort that bordered on the impossible, Sarnosky dragged himself upright. His hands shook violently as he reached for the twin 50s. He couldn't stand. He couldn't kneel. He braced his body against the mount and leaned forward. Through blurred vision, he saw the incoming fighters. He smiled, and he fired. The guns roared to life once more. The first Zero caught the full-burst square in the engine. It detonated mid-air, vanishing in a cloud of flame. The second veered violently, clipped by rounds that shredded its wing. It spun out of control and disappeared into the clouds below. The remaining Japanese pilots broke formation. For the first time, they hesitated, not out of surprise, but fear. This bomber would not die, but the victory came at a terrible price. Sarnosky slumped forward, his body finally giving out. He never moved again. In the cockpit, Zeamer felt the bomber sag. The altimeter unwound rapidly. They were losing altitude fast. One engine flamed out completely, its propeller windmilling uselessly. Another coughed and sputtered, moments from failure. Zeamer knew the truth. They were not going to make it home. But the mission was complete. The camera stopped clicking. The last frame had been exposed. They had what they came for. The Japanese fighters regrouped for one final strike. Zeamer made a decision. With the last of his strength, he banked the bomber away from Bougainville and pointed it toward open ocean. The movement exposed the damaged aircraft's profile, inviting pursuit. The Zeros followed. They attacked again, but without the coordination they'd shown earlier. Fatigue and shock had taken their toll. They fired from longer range, less precise. Old 666 endured. A final Zero made a reckless close pass, misjudging the bomber's remaining firepower. A waist gunner stitched rounds across its fuselage. The fighter disintegrated in a spray of fragments. And then, just like that, the attack stopped. The Japanese pilots broke off, low on fuel and ammunition, unwilling to lose more aircraft to a bomber that refused to die. Silence fell. Only the roar of damaged engines remained. Inside Old 666, the crew took stock. The aircraft was a wreck. More than 600 holes punched through the fuselage. Entire sections shredded. Systems destroyed. Half the crew wounded or dead. Joe Sarnosky lay still in the nose. Jay Zeamer slumped in his seat, barely conscious. His body broken, but his hands still locked around the yoke. They had survived. Barely. The long flight home began. Slow, agonizing, uncertain. Every minute was a gamble, but Old 666 kept flying. The flight back to base was longer than the battle. With one engine dead and another barely holding together, Old 666 limped across the Pacific like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. Every vibration threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Every minute felt borrowed. Inside the bomber there was no celebration, only exhaustion. The crew worked in silence, tending wounds with shaking hands, stuffing rags into bullet holes to slow leaks, watching gauges with hollow eyes. Blood stained the floors. The smell of burnt oil and cordite clung to the air. Jay Zeamer drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, pain consumed him. When he faded, nightmares took over. Flashes of fire, falling aircraft, Joe Sarnosky's last stand in the shattered nose. At one point, the bomber began to lose altitude again. The remaining engines were overheating, pushed far beyond their safe limits. The crew dumped everything they could, unused ammunition, equipment, anything not bolted down, to lighten the load. Still, the altimeter unwound. Zeamer forced himself awake. He had lost too much blood to think clearly. His vision doubled. His hands trembled. But he wrapped his good arm around the control yoke and held the aircraft steady. If he passed out completely, everyone died. Hours later, the faint outline of land appeared on the horizon. New Guinea, home. The sight broke something in the crew. Men who had survived flak, fighters, and death itself began to cry openly. Not from joy, but from the sudden release of terror they'd been holding back for hours. Old 666 made its approach. The landing gear lowered with a sickening hesitation. One wheel locked into place. The other shuddered, then finally dropped. Zeamer guided the bomber down as gently as he could, fighting fading consciousness. The aircraft hit the runway hard. Metal screamed. Tires blew. The bomber skidded sideways, sparks spraying from the damaged landing gear. But it stayed upright. When it finally ground to a halt, Ground crews rushed forward, then stopped in their tracks. They stared in disbelief. Old 666 looked less like an airplane and more like wreckage that had somehow learned to fly. Its fuselage was riddled with holes. Entire panels were missing. Blood stained the nose. Smoke curled from shattered engines. They counted the damage later. Over 600 bullet and shrapnel holes. It was a miracle the aircraft had not broken apart mid-air. Medics pulled Jay Zeamer from the cockpit. He was barely alive. His leg was destroyed. His wrist shattered. His body was in shock from blood loss and trauma. Doctors later said that if the flight had lasted even 10 minutes longer, he would not have survived. Joe Sarnosky was pronounced dead at the scene. He had held his position until the very end, firing until his body simply could not continue. In the days that followed, the photographs developed in the dark rooms told their own story. The images were perfect. Clear shots of Japanese airfields, anti-aircraft placements, aircraft counts, defensive layouts. The intelligence gathered from that mission directly shaped the planning of the Bougainville campaign, an operation that would break Japanese control in the region. The mission was deemed one of the most successful reconnaissance flights of the war, and one of the most expensive. Jay Zeamer spent months in hospitals, undergoing surgeries to save his leg and repair his shattered wrist. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never flew combat again. When he recovered enough to stand, the Army finally acknowledged what he and his crew had done. Captain Jay Zeamer was awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the highest decorations for valor in American military history. Joe Sarnosky was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. They were the only pilot and bombardier to receive the nation's highest award for the same mission. Old 666 was retired. No one tried to fly it again. It had done more than any aircraft had a right to do. Among air crews, the story spread quickly. The cursed plane that refused to die. The misfit pilot who turned a scrap heap into a weapon. The crew of outcasts who faced 17 fighters alone and survived. The bad luck bird was no longer feared. It was respected. Years later, historians would argue over numbers. How many zeros were shot down? How many attacks were made? How long the battle truly lasted? But the men who were there didn't argue. They remembered the noise, the fire, the blood. They remembered a bomber flying straight and level through hell because it had to. Old 66 never flew again, but on June 16, 1943, it flew into legend.